Um, First, I think Ryan, probably best. I know we've done this every single week, but probably best if you'd like to introduce yourself just
Sure.
briefly again for some of the maybe newer people in the audience, and then we'll get started.
Sounds good. Hi, thanks very much. I'm Ryan Lackey. I'm Chief Security Officer at Evertas Insurance Company. We're the world's first crypto asset insurance company. I've been involved in crypto since really the 1990s. I got involved from the cyberpunks mailing list and discovered computer security and crypto and everything else from the world of anonymous electronic cash, and have seen the industry grow and change in all sorts of exciting ways. One of the really nice things about working at a company like Evertas is we get to see all sorts of new threats that happen, all loss events, all the underwriting that gets done, where we're looking at the security measures that people are putting in place to prevent the next generation of attacks, and really seeing what works, what doesn't work, what costs people the most to do, and really the cutting edge of what's being done. And the other nice thing about insurance is we get to bring the rest of the industry up to the standards of the top like 5% of the industry, because by setting it as a requirement in underwriting or as a major factor, we can definitely encourage the best practice and make it easier for people to see not just this might help us, but this will help us by this quantified amount, which is definitely a good way to do it. That's happened in every other industry before and needs to happen in computer security to make the industry as mature as it needs to be to handle the economy of 7 billion people.
Got it. Thank you, Ryan, for that brief intro. I'm also Chad, your host here, and we've now been hosting these spaces for the past couple of weeks with Evertas, going over a bunch of different things. This week we're talking on really the behind the scenes on many of the different Web3 hacks we've seen in the past couple of years, as well as previous to the past couple of years. Give, of course, Evertas a follow. Look out for the great content that they're putting out. And Ryan, maybe you remind me as well, what is the website where people can find more on a lot of the stuff we're talking about last week and today as well?
Sure. We have a URL at evertas.com/notes that has information specific to these talks. And also our website, evertas.com, has lots of information about security in the cryptocurrency industry as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Ryan. Um, Moving right into it. So today's, of course, discussion is really behind the scenes of Web3 hacks. Um, and I think, based on really a few hacks that we've really identified and seen in the past, what is the typical background and really skill set of some of the most successful attackers?
Sure. There's really different categories of attackers, and there's successful and unsuccessful within those categories. I think early on there were a lot of people that were more traditional uh, network penetration kind of hackers that were uh, software exploiters, like pretty traditional hackers that just saw crypto as yet another thing to attack. The amazing thing about crypto is it's pretty easy to go like in regular and compromises. The hard part is monetizing your compromise once you've made the compromise. Uh, in crypto, the difficulty is not so much being able to monetize it once you've done it, but in getting through the defenses to begin with. So there's this whole like traditional hacker world. There's also the world of ransomware, which is really its own unique thing, where crypto is not the vulnerability, but crypto is an enabling technology for taking payments from people that are victims of compromises. So, like a local hospital or a local school system or water treatment plant or somebody else who just has very, very lax computer security, which is just sort of a unfortunate reality of these um, underfunded organizations that might not even have full-time security people. They might have, if they're lucky, full-time IT people, but not even security-focused people. But they're doing very critical things like giving us safe water and hospitals and everything else. And if they get compromised, usually what happens is their data is wiped, it's locked, and to release their systems, or return their system access to them, they're told to pay a ransomware payment. And as much as I hate ransoms and everything else, both physical ransoms and information ransoms, sometimes it is the economically rational choice. If your harm from not paying the ransom is millions of dollars and the ransom is hundreds of thousands of dollars, it might actually be a better choice to pay the ransom, especially if it's a hospital or a water treatment plant or something like that, where there's potentially lives in the balance. So crypto is used in the ransomware industry, but is not itself a vulnerability there. Another sort of unfortunate thing is there's a lot of people that are in the crypto industry that They learn a lot about things that are going on, and maybe they're not happy with their relatively well-paid salaries to begin with, and they learn things about maybe competitive projects or even maybe even projects they work themselves on, and they are actually the exploiters. So there's a lot of people within the industry that are taking advantage of the information they learn from working on various projects and using that against various projects, maybe even insider threat, which is something we can talk about later. And then the fourth category I'd say is nation states. They're their own category where they're really doing this as a industrial, um, well-funded operation. North Korea being the exceptional case with Lazarus Group, but this happens in other places as well, where they're using it as a way to fund all sorts of really horrible things, like North Korea using it to fund their nuclear weapons program and a lot of their international stuff. They've done a bunch of other. They used to make very high quality methamphetamine and export it. They made a lot of really high quality $100 bill forged counterfeit notes and use those to fund their operations. And then they've turned into computer network penetration and cryptocurrency attacks as a way to fund these things. So there's really these four different categories, and they don't really overlap too much.
Got it. And what do we really see today more of? Network hacks or protocol code exploits?
So I think you see a large number of traditional computer network penetration kind of things, like what you might call a network hack, things, and also things like social engineering, phishing, things like that. So very traditional, very easy, very boring things. Those happen in very large numbers, but the individual take from those incidents is not usually that big. There are some exceptions where, for instance, an exchange is hacked for 200 or 120,000 BTC, but it's usually the case that certainly end user wallets don't hold that much money, so there's a limit to how much you can gain. The the really big hacks that we saw in 2022, especially, were sort of like protocol exploits. They were either on-chain protocol vulnerabilities with how things were deployed, or they were taking advantage of things that were deployed and just incorrect behavior from them. So like trading, like Oracle attacks and things like that. So I think in terms of number of attacks, it's certainly network penetrations and social engineering. And in terms of total value lost, at least 2021, like since DeFi, it has been protocol exploits.
Got it. And I think going back to um, just that first question as well, talking a little bit about sort of like the Lazarus group. I know you pointed them out specifically. Is there like how many others, is there really out there like that? I think maybe we know Russia, we know China, have somewhat similar groups, maybe not in the same form of incentives that they're going after, but how many others potentially is there of sort of like hostile countries just doing this for their industrial complex?
Yeah, I think North Korea is a unique attacker because they need foreign, like they're a poor country that has sovereignty and has technical expertise in doing this stuff and is completely immoral, not even amoral. So they are unique in that they will just go after cash as quickly as they can to go for it. Um, Other nation states, I'd say like China and Russia, especially, but also the U.S. if you're a hostile power to the U.S., are going for things other than just small, like relatively small amounts of cash. For a nation state, billions of dollars in cash is not a huge amount of money for most of these top tier nation states. For North Korea, it is a huge and very material amount of money. So the U.S. it would be like a rounding error for our federal budget if they stole $1 billion from an exchange or something like that. So the these skills, I'm sure the U.S. has the best. Well, maybe it's optimism, but I would hope that the U.S. would have the best people in the world, and I would hope that our other close allies have the best people in the world. But I think U.S., China, Russia, Israel, almost certainly, other very capable countries that have like very powerful intelligence apparatuses, and just basically you can use the quality of their domestic IT security industry as a good proxy for how good their government sponsored operations are. Those countries probably have the greatest capability for doing this kind of stuff, but outside of North Korea, they're usually not being used for just stealing cryptocurrency. They're being used for, in the case of China and China specifically, there is a lot of economic espionage, but it's usually like China can make more money by penetrating like DuPont's network and stealing the formula for some new special product, or how to make a really good quality gas turbine from like single crystal gas turbine from GE or somebody like that. So that is where they go for. Russia, it's almost always national security. Like very large numbers of countries go after their diaspora community internationally for like domestic security threats. So like Iran goes after overseas Iranian individuals all the time, and there's great groups like the Citizen Lab up at University of Toronto that helps people defend against this kind of thing. So UAE, one of our allies, does go after what they view as security threats to the UAE, which is a pretty expansive definition of like anti-slavery, pro-civil rights people operating in the country. So there's a lot of countries that do this for like pure national security reasons, which are not really economically motivated. But yeah, North Korea is in a class by itself for going after cryptocurrency for purely economic reasons. They're somewhere in between. Like there's a whole range of like criminal organization, like purely criminal, non directly nation state affiliated organizations, and then there's North Korea, and then there's the national security nation states that are really in there.
Got it. And I think we just had Jay join as
Hi
well.
guys,
Hey Jay.
sorry, my
I do.
horrible apologies. I've been dealing with some fires here on the Evertas side, but the good kind.
Of course. No, I hear you. Jay, if you want to do maybe a quick intro about yourself, I know we've been talking for the past 10 to 15 minutes, but maybe best to just quickly intro for anyone in the audience, and then we'll continue on with this great conversation.
Sure. Founder and CEO of Evertas, along with my co-founder Raymond. Engineer by training, was hired by the Bulge Bracket Bank, and then worked at the world's first custodian bank. Did a bunch of risk stuff, regulatory stuff, and POCs, enterprise blockchain projects, things like that. Was looking at institutional custody for crypto, realized there's a big issue around insurance, so started that and have a hobby that's growing into a bit of an expertise around kind of privacy and security generally. I've been in the crypto space and blockchain space since 2015. So it's been a while. Not like Ryan, who's been in the crypto and blockchain space since before there was crypto and blockchain as a space. I think he's at like 24 years or something like that.
Yeah. No, awesome. Thank you for that, Jay. All right, Ryan. Back to you. Um, how do how do typically attackers find the exploits they end up using? Do they stumble upon them? Are they actively searching them? Are they in some sort of groups that are all actively looking for them? How do they usually find this stuff?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It breaks down into the type of exploit it is. If it's a traditional computer network penetration, a lot of that stuff is not so much novel, like zero, like it's called zero day, like things that have just been released, so there's no known defense against them. Those are sort of the holy grail. That's what nation states usually use to attack the most well defended adversaries. But probably 95% of things that involve technical compromise of a system like that, using non crypto stuff, are using things that are known, are disclosed, and for which patches exist. So it's really people not applying patches quickly enough to their systems, which happens because of, I mean, just complexity is the enemy of security, and you have all sorts of large organizations. Like there's a lot of organizations in crypto that have hundreds or even thousands of staff, and they have lots of computers, lots of systems. If you're somebody like an exchange, you've got to operate on so many different networks. You have a whole bunch of functionality you need to do, and those systems are just so big and have so many interconnected pieces that something often doesn't get patched in time, and so there's potential vulnerability there. Phishing is even worse because there's not even necessarily a true technical vulnerability. Although I would argue that if there's a system that doesn't have the right protections in place to prevent a single employee from being tricked into doing something by accident, that's a technical vulnerability or a deficiency in the system as well. But phishing is really just exploiting humans, and as the number of humans goes up and as the attention humans spend on certain transactions goes down, then that becomes an easier attack. So there's that whole category. So those are sort of very traditional. Like they find those things through, if you like, there's a whole process of how you do the attack. But if you know someone's running a certain system and you can profile that they're vulnerable to certain attacks, then or certain versions of software they're using, certain systems, you can look and see what the known vulnerabilities are. It's a whole complex issue there. Um, the more interesting category are the crypto specific things like the on-chain exploits, and for those, there's really a couple different ways you can find those vulnerabilities. Like you, the most interesting ones are people who see how a smart contract is written. So they have a background, usually some sort of development background, um, and they can really understand how a particular smart contract works. And then once you've looked at these things, either from an audit perspective or a test perspective, or just from a like hacker mindset, you learn what kind of error conditions cause certain kinds of failures in these things. Like there was the whole reentrancy category of attacks that you could exploit. And so once people discovered that general broad category, you would then look for those in every single system that you interacted with. There's other like broad categories of things like that that you can look for specific instances of vulnerability in each individual smart contract you work with. But there's also there's a lot of these where it's pretty suspicious. So it seems like possibly there's like insiders who see a vulnerability who report it. And like one of the things I'm afraid of is that um, like bug bounties are a great system, and bug bounties pay out a certain amount of money when you report if you discover something through legitimate means or whatever. But the gains from exploiting these things might actually be higher than the bug bounty. So there's cases where people become aware of it through various legitimate courses of doing stuff, and then instead of providing it through the bug bounty, they probably provide it to somebody who's exploiting it. So there's potentially some of that insider information that's passed on as well. But a lot of these things, it would be great if most of these were novel attacks that are specific to, like you write a new smart contract and you made some mistake in it and there's some new vulnerability in it and it affects only you. But unfortunately, that is not usually the case. Usually what it is there's a broad category of attacks and someone discovers that and they use that against, they look for it, then that same vulnerability in a bunch of different systems, or a specific piece of code, like a smart contract component or whatever else is used by a bunch of different projects, and then it has a common vulnerability. So it becomes the same thing as traditional network computing, where you've got 0-day and then you've got the patching problem. The same thing applies on chain. The difficulty with on chain is it's visible to everyone in the world just by looking at the chain, like what versions of things you're using and when it's been updated. So it's really easy to say, oh, this particular piece of software now has a vulnerability. You can then look on chain and find everybody who's using it, and then it becomes a race to exploit it. And they may not even be in a position to upgrade. So it might be truly bad for them.
Got it. And I'm guessing some of these attacks, really, of course, have to come from insiders. So how do they really pull it off when you need multiple signers to move tokens? And sometimes those people can, of course, be, top level employees.
Yeah, we've seen insider stuff where the system was designed on paper to require a bunch of separate employees to sign off on transactions, and it was done pretty well. But honestly, if you have an organization an organization the size of like Coinbase definitely has multiple teams that can do operations and multiple teams that can do code development. But any small software project that is rapidly being developed really has hopefully independent people doing operations on the signing operations side. But the software developers are a pretty small set, and it's pretty easy for one developer to be uh, developing the code that everyone's using, and everyone relies on the same piece of code. So if there's a vulnerability that somehow somebody discovers, and that's it is implausible to have a system where everything is caught in advance. And it's a homogeneous enough code base that if it's a system where a simple error in a system can lead to compromise, then it's pretty hard to prevent that from happening. And the art of security in this case is making sure that isn't a large compromise. So either there's a way that the loss from any single error like that is constrained by a total amount that's a risk to it, because perhaps there's multiple systems, or it is a system where compromising it takes other independent systems that have to be compromised in order to actually exfiltrate funds or cause a loss event. So it's not simply a single piece of code, but a lot of these smart contract systems, there's a desire to make them very simple, and as a result, there are like single things that protect very large amounts of money, and if there's a bug in that, whether that bug is maliciously added, whether that bug is discovered and then not reported, or whether that bug is just honestly there and then first discovered by somebody, that is a thing that could be exploited. But I don't know how big the insider threat really is in a lot of these things. A lot of these, so there's non-traditional, there's corporations that build things, but there's a lot of like non-traditional organizations where you're working with people on a DAO or something, and you've never even met the people. So it would be reasonable to assume that not everyone involved in an anonymous project is like fully aligned in values. Maybe it is with a very, very small project where everybody's working together at the beginning. But once there's a project that has lots of funds, you have to assume that there's the potential for some sort of adversarial parties to be involved. So I think that's a risk as well.
Got it. And Jay, I wanted to get your sort of thoughts here. If you have any thoughts on the last couple of questions as well, to the points of like how do attackers typically find the exploits they use? Maybe any insight you might have to these last couple of questions.
Well, I certainly wouldn't put myself at the level of Ryan here, but I think a lot of times they just get lucky, and what I mean by that is someone's poking around and they find a vulnerability, and then they find out that, hey, actually, these systems haven't been set up properly. So a system where you think there's multiple people that are required, important key materials are stored in HSMs or some other secure means, and you find out that you realize that like the HSM is basically just being used as a key notary, and someone can just basically kind of compromise an API to have the HSM sign something, right? And so, we do see this where someone says, "Oh, we have some multi-sig solution. We have three independent signatures." But when you look at the actual architecture of the system, there's one API, call. There's basically one command that you can run that will essentially, have all three independent systems sign a transaction. And so, whether that's kind of an intentional architectural decision, right? Like, oh, I need to be able to move the assets at the fund because I'm a trader and I need to be able to move, so many dollars of assets, right? Or whether it's kind of just a sloppy implementation thing. We do see that a lot. I think some people make a lot of noise about the fact that they have, some very, super complicated, brilliant, unhackable kind of key management system, but it's all really being controlled from, one command, and the security on that API or the workstation or server that's being used that can issue those commands is not up to snuff, and you really are now falling back to kind of like a single password that may not be complex on like a random cloud server. So that's why I think not to kind of go back too much into underwriting, but we always look at risk from a very holistic way, which is you can't just say, oh, it's cold or it's hot storage or it's warm storage, or they use HSMs or they don't use HSMs. That's really the beginning of the conversation. It's actually how are these things set up and deployed, because a lot of the times it's not like, oh my God, they broke into the FIPS 142 level 3 HSM. It's like, oh, someone has is lazy or it's a small organization and one person is able to kind of move assets and issue transactions, and their systems were compromised. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. There's also so there's the systems as they're designed, whether there's a flaw where they're overlooking something. There's also a lot of changes that happen after systems are deployed, as we've seen in a few cases where a system was designed really well to have all that isolation, multiple people, multiple systems, everything else. And then for purely operational reasons, the system sort of collapsed into a sort of degraded state. And I guess normalization of deviance is the phrase that's used in the safety engineering community for that. And they were just operating in a less secure state on an ongoing basis, where maybe there was an initial requirement that you had like 9 separate nodes sign something, and then they were all run by separate organizations, and then a few of them merged and a few of them got copied onto the same servers, and it ended up with essentially like two needed to be compromised to do it. So there's a lot of compromises like that happen like after you design a system and put it in the real world and how it was deployed. Or maybe it was designed a certain way and then actually implemented in a different way.
Got it. Well, I think we're coming close to almost 30 minutes now on this space. Wanted to just quickly say, give of course Ryan a follow, Evertas, Jay, and of course Jay a follow as well. We're doing another space, at least one more space, I think, around hacks, security. It's not going to be next week, but it'll be the following week, just because there is ETH Denver next week, and I think a lot of people will be of course attending. But of course, give all these great speakers a follow. Definitely Ryan for the following weeks when we do have that last at least planned space for now. Ryan, getting back to some of the questions, really looking back, do we see signs of a really small scale proof of concept testing before the main event? How risky is that testing, and how will it be really noticed?
Yeah, I think that really falls into different answers for the different kinds of attacks. If it's the traditional network penetration type attack, then you certainly see probes and everything else. The problem with that is you see those same probes happening whether or not there's a successful penetration. Like, I think that now, if you set up a server now with SSH on an open port 22 with a public IP, someone probes that within about 2 minutes with Showdown and then with a connection attempt. So there's a lot of this probing that just happens on networks all the time. So a lot of people don't have their network set up to even see when that's happening. So a lot of the stuff you can see after the fact. You see, oh, there was an attempt made 3 or 4 days earlier, it was unsuccessful, or it escalated, or whatever else. So people look at that, but they don't usually see these things in advance and get some real-time warning on it. The different category would be on-chain stuff, where you often do see transactions that are attempted against something. The problem is a lot of time, what looks like an attack and what looks like just misconfiguration or mistakes or normal use or whatever is hard to distinguish. So if you've got a system that if you deploy a new smart contract and you aren't using it and hasn't been publicized or anything else, and you see people interacting with it substantially, that's a little bit more of a red flag than if it's an existing contract that's deployed and you just see people interacting with it in what look like normal patterns and things like that. Like, we've seen a lot of DeFi related things where flash loans were used to take something from basically to break the assumption that an attacker would need to have huge amounts of funds to do an attack. So it expanded the number of potential attackers, and you would have expected to, basically that eliminates a lot of this advanced probing at the larger scale. So you wouldn't see a lot of the steps. So it's easier to see after the fact. Like, the great thing about blockchains is you have a global immutable ledger of all the transactions that go through. So you can look after the fact and find a bunch of things that were done. But it's really hard for people to do the surveillance to find these things in advance. There are some projects working on that, and it certainly is best practice to do this for certain kinds of things, but it's pretty hard to tell from on-chain activity.
Got it. And I think something that's going to be really interesting, probably question and answer, is how do attackers cover their tracks before, during, and after?
Yeah, that is probably the most difficult part of the whole thing, both in the traditional kind of penetration world and in on-chain attacks. So traditional penetration world, people do the crazy stuff where if, for instance, Russia were attacking something, they'd probably find a compromised North Korean box and use a North Korean IP and make it look like it's actually a North Korean group attacking or whatever else. So you can do some stuff there with your network stuff on traditional network attacks to look like someone else or to disguise your identity in some way. You can potentially, in a lot of cases, the attacks get to where they do by looking for the less monitored, less defended parts of systems. So they look for instance, a partner's computer system that's already given privileged access or routinely accesses your system. So you compromise a less defended system and then use that to pivot into the the more protected system, and it's less suspicious if like your HVAC vendor is routinely connecting to HVACs deployed at your stores, and you then have connections coming from your HVAC vendor, and then it goes from there, which is what happened with I think it was TJ Maxx or something a while ago. So there's some that sort of thing happens in the traditional world. In the crypto world, I think so. It's a lot harder to see the attacks, I think, before they happen and to go there, but it is much easier to trace money and follow money and everything else after it happens. And especially if it's a smart contract, like on-chain thing, there's a whole range of like where gas comes from and things like that is a system is an indicator that can be traced, and you can look and find all sorts of network analysis on those financial flows to try to track down who the attackers were, how it worked, everything else. Another way that a lot of attackers, the way that like the APTs and the advanced persistent threats in the traditional world are identified is they use the same attack techniques against their targets, the same probing techniques and everything else. So you can sort of tell that the attacker who uses a certain kind of exploit is known to be this attacker. So in some cases they try to hide that signature by using someone else's tools. But and famously, there was a collection of CIA's own tools, the Vault 7 thing, that was compromised and is now used by a lot of other people. So there's a bunch of stuff like that happens. But you can look at the way they attack and the kind of their choice of targets. Like, you know that certain criminal organizations go after certain kinds of organizations, and especially with like ransomware gangs and things like that. So there's some patterns. It's basically just patterns and doing data analysis on patterns, whether it's the network flows, whether it's the types of attacks and indicators, things like that. And it's sort of a interesting problem. It actually would be an interesting sort of like AI ML problem, because it's huge amounts of data, and you could then use that to do some of this analysis. But a lot of the things are much more obvious signals than that. And once you know what the signal is, you can look for it in your logs. The problem is people aren't looking proactively for this kind of stuff. It's always after the fact. So forensically, you can say, oh, this was most likely hit by this particular organization, but it doesn't really necessarily help you in advance.
Got it. Jay, I wanted to see if you had any answers to this as well. I think this is one of the most interesting questions probably today, but I wanted to see if you had any thoughts as well. Might be.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I know there's like attempts, like there's like the MITRE ATT&CK framework where people are like trying to like create like the characteristics or profiles of different behaviors. I think, for a long time it was said, attribution should be left to the people with badges and guns, but on the non kind of intelligence, non-law enforcement side, you don't care about attribution. What you really care about is just securing your systems and trying to kind of prevent penetrations, prevent further damage or infiltration of your network. That's not great. That's not really viable for a couple of reasons. I mean, first off, as an insurance company, we do have to kind of know who's responsible, because it makes a difference sometimes in terms of claim payouts. Is this a nation state acting as part of a military action and it's under a war exclusion? Is it a terrorist related entity that's doing this as part of some sort of a cyber attack or to support terrorist activities, and it comes under one of these TRIA coverages or things where you can kind of get backstop potentially by the federal government. So the attribution question, which isn't even particularly clear at kind of the nation state level, and if you look at like the time it takes like the FBI to put an indictment for like Sandworm or something, right? Or it shows how hard that investigative work is, even when they have the full resources of the U.S. federal government and its allies, which is pretty intense. And so it's not great. There's a lot of people who are out there, as Ryan said, like masquerading as other people, and people will be like, oh, we see Cyrillic characters, but actually like then someone finds like there's a comment that actually is in Mandarin, and they think, oh, maybe this actually was a Chinese actor. It is kind of a mess. It is kind of confusing. I think in general, you want to try to operate where you don't necessarily have to find attribution, because I think it is so so challenging. But it's important to at least collect the forensic data, and even if you don't know, today you might have more information down the road, whether there was a leak or, we saw this with like I think it was Conti or some of the ransomware gangs, where after the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, there was kind of like a schism within these groups, and like a lot of internal data leaked out, and that could be helpful to identifying certain things. And that identification is helpful for, let's say, recovery assets. So, not just kind of we want to throw them in jail, or we want to identify bad nation state actors, or, national security threats, but even from a kind of a lowly insurance perspective, which is, clearly on the civilian side. Knowing who's after you, why, what their motivations are, and understanding, how you could potentially go after them. Like, oh, we're looking for, Jane Doe, John Doe, and when they're arrested somewhere, that you want to try and, extract resources, extract kind of their ill-gotten gains back from them, which has happened a few times. That is important to know, and it is not straightforward, unfortunately, and it's probably going to get less straightforward with time, is my guess.
Yeah, another good thing about about blockchain-based systems is essentially the record is permanent. So it's entirely possible that at the time of the attack, you don't have all the data that you would need to be able to trace funds backwards. But if it went through an organization like, say, Alphabet or something like that, and then later, like a year later, the Alphabet is compromised in some way by law enforcement, you can then de-anonymize a lot of things that you wouldn't have been able to de-anonymize at the time of the attack. So one of the strengths of government and law enforcement is that they can gather all this data and just sit on it for a long period of time, because they don't have to necessarily it sucks for the victims, but for the purpose of deterring future attacks, it's okay for prosecution to take years, as long as it's the certainty of prosecution that matters, and the accuracy. And there's a lot of cases where they've gathered data and they've gone after things that are years down the line and been pretty successful there.
Perfect. Now, Ryan, many hacks are, of course, attributed to the Lazarus Group in North Korea. What do we really know about the Lazarus Group, and what kind of clues tend to point to them, assuming the origin of many of these attacks are always obfuscated?
Yeah, they are essentially some sort of cybercrime / government organization strongly tied to North Korean intelligence. They've been around for a while, probably since like the late, like 2008, 2009. And I have no firsthand information on this. This is all government information or from other security companies, but essentially they are the most the most cash motivated of all of these organizations. That they'll go after cryptocurrency with the highest end nation state kind of attacks, but they'll go for hundreds of millions, tens, hundreds, or billions of dollars worth of assets to do stuff. They came on the scene. They've done a lot of like more traditional things like pre-cryptocurrency stuff, but I think the Sony thing was probably the most famous thing in popular media, where they basically did not like a movie, so they were associated with compromising Sony as a result of that. It was a movie about the North Korean political leader. So there's stuff there, but they've really, since probably 2017, 2018, also gotten into cryptocurrency a lot. So South Korea is very, very pro crypto, and there's a lot of end user crypto stuff. And South Korea is a particular target of the North Korean organizations. So I think that was part of it. Also, they probably got into it from doing like ransomware stuff. They were involved in some various like worm things that used basically did cryptocurrency for unlocks, and that probably also exposed how valuable cryptocurrency was to them. The issue with crypto before like 2015, 2016 is it just wasn't enough money even for them to care about. But crypto's gotten to like substantial amounts of money, so there was that. I don't know, they're pretty unique. Like there's a thing in law about like hard cases make bad law or something like that, and they're also why Tornado Cash became an issue. So there's the whole like traditional. They've done a bunch of attacks, and then they were, as we can talk about later, they were trying to like launder money essentially through systems, and they appear to have used some mixers online substantially for that. And as a result of that, government has gone after a smart contract and sanctioned the smart contract. So um, there's it's they're very interesting. They're the multifaceted organization, and I don't think too much is known in open sources about how they operate internally. Like, I don't think much is known about how the North Korean government really operates internally, but they're yes, they're a major threat to pretty much any sort of entity that has cryptocurrency at a certain scale.
Ryan, weren't they also the ones that did the Bank of Bangladesh hack?
Yes, yes, they've done a bunch
Okay.
of non-crypto stuff. Like it was really crypto. So the Bank of Bangladesh hack was a uh, the luckiest thing possible. So they were it was like $1 billion hack where they were doing some stuff on Swift, like the international wire system, and they basically misspelled something, and otherwise they would have lost $1 billion, and instead they only lost like 50 or $100 million. So uh, yeah,
Wow, that's pretty insane. I was going to ask a little bit more about the Bank of Bangladesh hack because that's not something I heard of. When was that?
I think it was like 2015, 2016.
Yeah, I
Wow.
was going to say 2015. Which, not to get on an advocacy point here. I mean, the idea, there's this idea that like, oh, if cryptocurrency didn't exist, there would be no ransomware, there would be no criminal activity, everything would be hunky dory. That's kind of clearly not true. And also, as I point out, the fact that people are kind of looking at, hey, how do we secure our systems, is not a bad thing. Um, and historically, what you don't want to do is have it so everyone thinks everything's fine, but people who are interested in more kind of nation state or destructive type of attacks, as opposed to just kind of um, remunerative ones, are basically a free reign because everyone's like, oh, there's no cryptocurrency. I'm also not entirely sure. I also don't believe that ransomware wouldn't have happened without cryptocurrency.
Yeah, it certainly has helped, but
Clearly, it's
it
helped
was
it,
done
but
before. Like
yeah,
just like shareware, you used to like buy a money order or whatever and mail it to some address. Like this did exist, and there would have been some system, but I think ransomware did get turbocharged by cryptocurrency just as an easy online payment system for a while.
yeah, I agree.
But there were also
Um,
bank wire attacks I think the Citibank in '96 was the first one. It was like a $10 million hack, and there have been $1 billion attacks even in the first decade of the 20th century. So it's cryptocurrency makes it sort of democratizes access to this kind of stuff. Like it would be much harder for a non-banking insider to do a an attack on a Fedwire system or something like that because just the knowledge is so compartmentalized. It's not open source, everything else. But the also the motivation to fix those systems and make them better isn't really maybe there. But yeah, apparently they misspelled the word foundation in their request to do the transfer, and that's what got it caught by somebody at Deutsche Bank.
That's just wild.
Yeah.
Ryan, I know that you touched a little bit on what the Lazarus Group was doing a little bit of via mixers like Tornado Cash, um, but what is that sort of the typical process for turning stolen coins or stolen money into spendable cash? Are they somehow doing an OTC deal, with these stolen coins with some illicit actor probably outside of the U.S.
Yep.
How is it sort of typically done?
Yeah, it really depends on the scale. Like it's pretty easy to launder uh, single digit millions, even double digit millions in most cryptocurrencies, like in Bitcoin or Ethereum, something where it's a small percentage of the overall float. There's OTC desks in places like China. Used to be in Ukraine, you could have somebody show up at your hotel with like a duffel bag full of more than five and less than $15 million in cash and US hundreds, and you could do a transfer in the lobby of your hotel with no records. So it that kind of stuff, like relatively small scales, I mean, huge amounts of money, but relatively small on the scale of some of these hacks, are pretty easy to do. Um, a lot of the larger attacks, you end up with. like they have a plan for how they're going um, to move their money after stealing it. So there's probably some where it's an opportunistic thing where they just somehow do some sort of exploit and then they worry about it after the fact. But these are usually the people who get caught pretty quickly or where the assets just sit there. Some of the more sophisticated ones, they clearly have some sort of plan set up in advance to move the funds into various things. A lot of cases they do cross chain moves because it's a lot harder to do cross chain tracking of transactions than it was on chain. Some of the more recent ones have gotten a lot more sophisticated where they're moving into either mixers like Tornado Cash or systems like Railgun got used. A few of the other zero knowledge systems have gotten used. The problem is almost all of the system and like Grin and some of the privacy currencies, obviously Monero gets used a fair bit. These systems have such low um, daily transaction volumes that if you steal $500 million and you suddenly want to launder it, it takes you months to be able to make it look like normal traffic on the network. And if you move it all in one big bundle, it's very obvious where this like huge, it's like that thing with a snake and the snake eats something that's huge and you see the huge animal like go down the snake. That happens with the stolen funds. So you see this like huge bundle of funds. It may change the wallet address, but it's pretty obvious that this is all moving. And even if it's broken up into different wallets, you just see a whole bunch of wallets that have never had activity before, all moving funds at the same time. So there's a lot of like network analysis that gets done on the chain data. There's people at every exchange, some of the really big OTC desks, all the like companies like Chainalysis. We have somebody, Robert, who's like pretty amazing who works with us. There's a lot of other there's people who are experts in tracing like on-chain moves and doing asset recovery. So there's that is a very difficult problem for people to solve at the very large scale of these thefts. It's probably the single most difficult problem for actually profiting from these. And because it sort of puts it puts such a limit on how successful these attacks are, at least in short term, it's at least, I think, a major reason why we don't see more crime on chain than we do, because there's definitely a lot of vulnerable systems out there.
Got it. Now, I wanted to see, Judd, I believe you're on the Evertas account. I wanted to see if you maybe had any questions so far as we get a little over 50 minutes on this space and probably a couple more questions left. Wanted to see if you had any thoughts so far. Wanted to ask a question as well or a follow-up question to Ryan or Jay. Unsure if you're there or maybe I just can't hear you. Oh, maybe not. Ryan, are you able to hear
I
now?
don't hear him. But yeah, one of the things that
Okay.
I'm most afraid about is actually insider threats in a lot of these things. So there's insider threats like as an individual in the organization, you're like always evil. There's insider threat where in traditional finance, one of the things you look for is people having gambling problems or sudden health difficulties or anything else, because even a completely morally upstanding insider, if it's like their kid is going to starve to death or die of some disease or something, they're probably willing to commit financial crime. They are more willing to commit financial crime than they would have otherwise to sort of solve that problem. So there's that kind of stuff. And then there's also external pressure. Like I uh, never want to be a person who can sign on my own signature at any given time. If somebody just walks up to me and puts a gun in my face, $1 billion transfer out of my company accounts, like that is a very bad position to be in, because on chain, it's widely known who you are and how much money there is. So if you're in a system where that happens, like that's a very bad position to be in. The only thing worse than being forced under duress to do some sort of transaction that you can do is being forced under duress to do some sort of transaction you can't do. So like someone saying you have to sign something like, oh, it's a multi-sig, and trying to explain what is a multi-sig to a person with a gun in your face is not a good situation. So there's the insider threat. All the internal controls and stuff that apply to insiders are a huge area of concern. Um, the solution to that is multi-organizational stuff and standardized components and everything else. The other thing that we see is as an insurance company, like all of these risks exist and we can sort of model them, and they're independent risks. So the risk that your project is going to get compromised by one of your developers having some like financial difficulty, or one of your software components having a bug in it and things like that. That's an independent risk. And one of the great things about insurance is you can take a bunch of these individual risks and aggregate them. And as long as it's a, on average, low risk, acceptable risk, you can make it make sense for people, even if it would be a existential loss for any single customer. The problem is in cryptocurrency, we're starting to see some correlated risks on certain things. So there was the profanity wallet generator that a huge number of projects were using, like, I don't know, like last year or the year before, or it was last year, where it would generate these like pretty addresses because they could put their name or whatever in it and do some iterations. But it was a common vulnerability that was used by a bunch of different people's projects, and it created weak keys. And once it was known that these keys were weak, some of these keys were used to control multi-sigs for DAOs and everything else. So it was known who was using it. It was very obvious they were using this thing, and you could attack a bunch of different people using the same exploit. So one of the things that scare us the most are like correlated attacks across the same technology used by multiple people. And we're trying to find some solutions to that around making, obviously, you try to make those individual things as strong as possible, and then also have some diversity in the ecosystem around what technologies are used so that there's not a single point of failure that can cause truly huge losses for everybody.
Got it. All right. Well, I think we're really towards the end of this space. Jay, I wanted to give you maybe to any of these sort of final points also a last word. Then want to give Ryan really a last word here, a couple last sentences before we close up this space, and really go from there.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, and I'm sure this is very repetitive with what I've said in some of the other spaces, but ultimately, this is a fairly complicated area of risk, and I think, it behooves all of us working in the space to make it a safe and responsible space, and that requires a bit of humility. It requires us to think, assume that we're not the smartest people in the room, assume that there are dedicated, serious attackers, including those with nation-state resources, who are going after you, because that is actually the case. And there are a lot of great projects, and there's been a lot of tools and progress and procedures that have been developed, to help really mitigate those risks. But this is not something that, if you're looking for insurance, talking to Joe Schmo insurance company that like gives you your auto insurance, or your standard kind of corporate insurance, is probably not in a good position to help underwrite. Certainly from a security perspective, I've seen lots of people say I'm a blockchain security person, and they're just some person who likes computers, and they don't really take they don't have a really good serious security mindset around these things. And so look, there are mistakes. People will make mistakes. There are going to be losses from an insurance perspective. There are going to be hacks. We all just need to kind of work together to make this a better space. And part of that is appropriately kind of incentivizing good behavior. That means investing in projects that are run by responsible people, focusing on core infrastructure instead of kind of what's the next fork of the fork of the fork to get number go up, so you can kind of dump your bags in a few months and hopefully make a little bit of return. And that's again being really risk focused. And I've seen projects with massive amounts of effort of funds that have been raised, and I mean like indescribably bad security, where like I honestly couldn't even believe what they were saying. I was literally speechless when I figured it out. I was like, wait, you have no controls. That's sort of kind of humility and kind of professionalism and sense of responsibility. I think, especially as the industry kind of somewhat unfairly gets a bad rap, and we're getting kind of more and more scrutiny from people. I think it behooves us all to kind of do our parts to try and address some of those legitimate concerns from other people and from regulators and the governments by being kind of responsible. On the flip side, I would also just say, like, to government agencies, regulators, and people, and some of the quote unquote web3 skeptics that say nothing useful has been built. That's not true. There's a lot of useful stuff here. You just have to kind of look at it, number one, and number two. The idea that somehow like waving a magic wand and cryptocurrency disappears doesn't mean that there's no money laundering, or that there's no criminal activity, or that there are no hacks, or that there are no ransomware activity, because all of that happened before cryptocurrency. And there are reasons, political reasons and ideological reasons beyond just financial reasons for people to continue doing that. So I think the more we can be kind of collaborative and make a safer ecosystem and kind of cybersecurity and privacy landscape for everyone, I think the better off, everyone will be, both kind of inside and outside the crypto industry.
Perfect. Ryan, I want to give you a one last sort of one-liner here as well, and then I'll close it out.
Sounds good. I think we're definitely seeing some really amazing work from different parts of the industry. So some things are getting better really, really quickly. Some parts of the industry are lagging. There's the gap between the most secure organizations and the least secure organizations is widening, and the level where people, like the amount of assets that are in the hands of people below a certain critical level of security is increasing day by day. So I think we need a combination of continued progress on making the best security even better, as well as bringing the acceptable security practice, like a minimum standard that is more widely deployed. So it's always a race between attackers and defenders, but I would like to see the industry as a whole be better at helping those that don't have as much infrastructure and resources be as secure as they possibly can be.